All right, we're broadcasting.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to the June 22nd, 2011 public hearing of Riverside County Planning Commission. To start this off, we kind of skipped over a short staff report, and I'm going to ask Dave Jones, our county geologist, to give us that staff report this time.
Chairman Ross, Planning Commissioners, we submitted earlier today a memo to the Commission that contained some revised conditions of approval and 2 new conditions of approval. We also submitted Commissioner Roth's, he had comments on our staff report and the EIR. We provided our response to comments in that package as well. And the memo also included 21 additional letters in opposition to the project, 1 neutral, and 8 additional support letters that we had received. Concludes my reports.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to emphasize that I had comments on both the EIR and on the staff report, and those are available. Limited number of copies of this room with our secretary, Ms. Ray, and anybody who wants to, anybody, I guess on the first come, first served, and if you don't, you can share them, go ahead and share those. You can find out what comments that I may have made on the EIR and the staff report. With that said, we're going to resume the hearing with folks from San Diego State, and the first speaker from San Diego State is Dr. Matt Ron. Mr. Ron has 10 minutes. If we can find the 4 people in here now, let's see. Julia, oh, come on. She's Schroeder. They close? Julia, are you here? Somebody's mistaken you. And Dwayne.
Right here.
There's Dwayne. Is Julia with you?
Right here.
Good. A nice pair. All right, let's see who else. Robert Scholes. Robert, are you here? Okay. And Carol Brady. Carol, are you here? See Carol.
Carol had to leave, but I'll go later.
Well, okay. Fill out a speaker slip donating your time, then, sir.
I'm on there for another.
Can't do it twice. Which one would you like? What's your name, ma'am? Kathleen Rowe. All right, we'll try to find it. We've got a pretty good sized stack of speaker slips up here, so we'll see if we can find it in there. All right, Mr. Ryan, you have 10 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman. My name is Matt Ron. I represent San Diego State University and the San Diego State University Research Foundation. We've been operating for nearly half a century as an outdoor laboratory and classroom. And what is a field station? Really, it's a library and a museum of the natural and physical world. It's a place where we house legacies of data, specimens, and our accumulated knowledge. And it's a place to provide a unique opportunity for advancing science. What makes it different than another piece of property? These are centers for scientific discovery. They're globally recognized, and in fact, the Ecological Reserve is nationally and internationally recognized. It's promoted by our leaders in the sciences and has been promoted by these leaders for nearly a century. They are often protected areas, and they often now represent the last of so many things worldwide. They also serve as test beds for research and education on the breadth and depth of the natural and physical sciences. In our review of the environmental impact report, we used recognized experts in geology, biology, ecology, climate change, conservation, physics, hydrology, environmental science, land use planning, and law. And these included researchers, professors, students, staff, and others associated with the field station, as well as subject matter experts. So what is significant? This is the first question that always comes up. We assume there's going to be impacts from a potential Liberty Quarry. The EIR was supposed to identify what those environmental impacts were, and the question we've been waiting to see answered is what is the impact on research and education? There are significant irreversible environmental impacts documented by the EIR, and we believe that the EIR did not go far enough in many of its sections to identify true environmental impacts. But despite that, those impacts that were identified should have a concomitant effect on the ecological reserve because we're a test bed for understanding the natural and physical world. So if there is a change in this, you would assume that there should be significant and unavoidable impacts to the ecological reserve. However, the EIR did not make that finding. The area is designated as rural mountainous, which will not be changed, and only allows resource development that is compatible with neighboring uses. As an ecological reserve, we feel that the proposed quarry is not a compatible use adjacent to a research laboratory and classroom. The EIR fails to give adequate consideration to project impacts on the reserve. It understates and fails to define and quantify the significance of impacts across all major categories, including air, hydrology, biology, etc. Many of the conclusions that are made in the document are not supported by scientific literature or even basic scientific principles. Many conclusions are not supported by suitable science or credible sources. It also finally fails to identify feasible mitigation strategies and basically ignores most of the most simple avoidance and minimization measures. Impacts extend beyond just the footprint of the quarry, and what we were hoping to see is an analysis on noise, light, blasting, vibrations, air pollution, water, etc., that would help identify those potential buffers that would extend beyond just the pit itself. And yet we haven't actually seen analyses that we can truly understand what the impact is. So let's start talking about a few of these. First is noise pollution impacts. It's well documented in the ecological literature that there's physiological and behavioral modifications and impacts to species and habitats. Increased stress means decreased health, which also leads to decreased reproductive success in many of our species. Therefore, a lot of these species choose to avoid noisy areas. This obviously has a direct link to the type of research that we do on the ecological reserve. When we talk about noise and light, again, we see artificial lighting has been well documented to impact behavior, breeding, migration, persistence. It serves as an attractive nuisance to a lot of these species, impacts health, foraging, and even the wildlife linkage, which again feeds back to impacts to research on the ecological reserve. The myth of directional lighting is something that we've looked into. It's assumed that if you point a light in a certain direction, that somehow there are no uplighting effects and no backlighting effects. This is obviously not the case, and certainly not how physics works. If you look at an impact to wildlife on lighting impacts, you assume directional lighting at the edge of a quarry, that lighting is actually visible from more than just the front direction of that light, which means wildlife moving behind will have uplighting effects, and from the sides will also be impacted by the visibility of this lighting, particularly when they're trying to move during the evening. So what do all these species have in common? Well, basically they're all animals, right? But beyond that, what the quarry assumes is that they're all treated identically. And in fact, they use the least Bell's Vireo as the benchmark for noise analysis. And somehow or other, all of these species are the same. We know that that's absolutely not the case, but the response to comments is that it's just too difficult to analyze. I spent about 5 minutes last night doing a quick internet search on articles that may be related to impacts with this particular issue, and there's plenty of them. We've provided a lot of this information in the draft response to comments. The best source, however, is urbanwildlands.org, which has done one of the best comprehensive jobs at pulling together this information. Again, all provided to the county earlier. When we talk about air quality impacts, again, the quarry and the EIR is assumed to have a north-south air movement pattern. We have, as you mentioned earlier, Commissioner, we do have sensors throughout the reserve, 66 sites collecting over 250 different types of environmental data. Very complicated site, needless to say. What surprised us, though, is that in the years of developing the EIR, there wasn't just a weather station placed on the property to help answer some of these questions. The weather data that were used in the analysis developed a combined hypothetical based on data from the North Station at Santa Margarita above the gorge, and data from Camp Pendleton 20 miles away, and upper air data from Miramar NAS 40 miles south. That's created a hypothetical place on the planet that probably doesn't actually exist. When we look at real data from our North Station, it doesn't follow a north and south gradient only. It typically has a weather pattern associated with the gorge itself. So if you include the impact that the gorge itself has on this airflow pattern, assuming even a pure north to south gradient, you'd recognize that there's sort of a north and eastern pushback from the Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve. And we've also observed that there's a bit of a pushback down to the south as well. Of course, you can do all the modeling you want to and collect all the data you want to, but the best litmus test was a fire that happened just below where the Liberty Quarry project exists. And as you'll see, yes, indeed, the 15 corridor does push things up north, but it also pushes, because of the gorge and the influence of the surrounding area, into the Temecula Valley and indeed south toward Red Hawk and Pechanga. Reserve impacts from air quality, basically it's an incredibly chaotic system. Scripps Institute of Oceanography has been using 25 weather stations roughly on our property for years, trying to understand small scale climate change impacts. And it's a very difficult process. It's actually easier to do global change studies than it is to do small scale studies on the ecological reserve. The ecological reserve is a reference site, which means people use it because of its pristine nature, and it includes research on ozone and nitrogen. And the climate change analysis included in the EIR is also seriously flawed. They basically ignored the issue. It doesn't follow what's considered industry standards at all. And in essence, what we're estimating is roughly just sort of a back of the envelope calculation by our global change research group is 250 times the carbon dioxide will be released into the environment rather than what is absorbed in its natural state. That's equivalent of putting roughly 5,000 people onto that property. One of the other things in the air analysis I wanted to emphasize that we've brought up multiple times is that the ecological reserve is the nearest school to the project site, and I'm not sure what we need to do to describe that, maybe putting up a sign or something. But it is an outdoor classroom and laboratory. That's the purpose of this property and has been for half a century. Let's talk about geological issues and seismic stability as well. In the EIR, and we've provided this in comment, there is a mischaracterization of faults. There is certainly a fracturing in the mountains. We've heard about that earlier today. And one of the things that we've identified is that that section of the mountain and part of the ecological reserve is within what's considered the impact zone of the Elsinore fault line. These fault fractures can extend, estimated up to potentially 5 kilometers into the earth. The EIR ignores the risk from blasting and mining and ignores the volumes of research literature and other documentation that talks about seismic-induced instability because of these types of activities. Even the rock type was misidentified in the EIR, and it is fractured and it is porous. Scientific uncertainty is one of the biggest issues in the EIR. It was stated earlier that there is absolutely no chance the quarry will trigger a seismic event. This is the 7.2 quake that happened last year, and the comments from these same researchers include this was a large unexpected earthquake, the location was the most unsettling feature, we need to rethink some of our main criteria, and the more data we get from big earthquakes, the more complexity we see. Just to highlight this, I met a gentleman a couple of weeks ago who received his PhD in geology before plate tectonics was an accepted axiom in geology. This has only been an accepted axiom since the 1950s and 1960s. This is a bit of a concern because we don't know everything there is to know. And having a project site like this adjacent to such a sensitive area could be a potential risk. Water quality and hydrology, I think, was very well covered by the city, and we concur. One of the things I wanted to highlight, though, is that there are 5 drainages within the project area. Drainage 1 and 3 are impacted by 15%, drainage 1 and 2 by 50%, and drainage 5 by 20%. The EIR assesses this and says there will only be 33 square feet of wetlands, resulting in a no net loss of wetlands or hydrologic impact. Our assessment, a quick GIS assessment, says it's actually closer to 2,500 linear feet. We've talked about hydrology. We want to highlight one quick thing here is that this is the headwaters to Stone Creek, which flows ultimately into the ecological reserve and is used as a reference site by both San Diego County and Riverside County for what water quality should look like in Southern California. And of course, the issue of dewatering is something that we're very concerned with. It is hydrologically active. We've all seen the waterfalls in the pictures and the flooding, and we know that springs and seeps and other features do exist on the property. This is the last fully protected free-flowing river, the last inland to coastal linkage, containing rare and endangered species in a pristine location. And I like to remind people that this is what Southern California looked like 100 years ago. That's what makes an important process or property for research. It is more sensitive to disturbance than other protected areas. Sensitive research relies on this pristine environment and has for nearly half a century. Reserve is unique and it cannot be reproduced or replicated elsewhere. And with that, I'd like to thank you for letting me ramble on.
Thank you. Any questions? Mr. Petty.
Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, you and I did have the privilege of touring the site with Matt and Paul Macaro of the Pechanga tribe. And it's one of those things, unless you are out there, you don't, as you said, pretty pictures are one thing, but you have to be out there. It's unfortunate that the rest of the commission could not have toured the site. My question is, given all of the weather stations on the property, we talked about this when we were on the tour, why wasn't that data made available to the applicants so that they could plug it into their air quality and other types of analysis that they did?
There's 2 caveats I wanted to mention. One is SDSU manages the property as a research site. So the research that's done on the property, sometimes there are projects. Other times they're from places like Scripps Institute, which in this case, the weather stations were managed by them. When this environmental review process began, Scripps Institute was kind enough to provide all of this proprietary data, and those particular to wind speed and direction, to the consultants. My recollection of the whole process is that they received the weather station data from us, which included the south side of the reserve, the center, and the north station that was ultimately used in the analysis. But the additional weather station data that were provided, the consultants had too much difficulty opening the files, reading the data, whatever the issue was. We offered multiple times to help rectify the situation, and then ultimately the issue was dropped completely. So that's all I can tell you about that.
So if they had to redo some of their studies, is there now some kind of protocol that's been put in place where they could contact you ahead of time and find out what, how best to make use of the data that you have already accumulated over however many years?
Absolutely. I mean, we're still collecting data. We still provide the information that we have ourselves. It's non-proprietary, and we'd be happy to help make the connection with those additional weather stations if they feel it's important enough for their research to be able to divulge that information at this point. Again, we don't control those folks, so it would be something that we'd have to discuss with them.
It was also, I think it needs to be clarified, you didn't prohibit them from coming onto the reserve or anything like that. They could, in terms of measuring the ambient noise on the reserve side of the project. So
no.
Was there a problem with that? I think it's important to note that the noise analysis that I saw focused mainly on the free as opposed to the reserve side of the project. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that's a fair statement. No, they have access to the reserve as do any researchers. The simple procedure is filling out an online research application. It goes through our review committee, and then we provide information on how to access and so forth. We did discuss with the consultants multiple times potential locations of where we thought sensors should be placed based on a representative sample of the ecological reserve. What was ultimately provided was not based on those recommendations. But they were given free access to the reserve as needed.
All right, thank you.
Let's see, the first thing you started out with was compatibility. And what I'm interested in is the distance from the actual reserve property and into the gorge area from the mine site itself. How far is that?
I've seen a couple of different numbers. It depends on how you slice the pie, really. And it depends on whether some of these assessments have used the center of the quarry site as the starting location rather than the edge. So it's about 1.5 miles approximately to the river.
Okay, and in your estimation, then that's incompatible.
It falls under, I think, the category of cumulative impacts. And so what we're looking at is not just an impact to hydrology. And I think Mr. Cato said it most eloquently earlier, which is we don't know. And that's one of the principles of science, is that we don't know the answers to everything. And in fact, a lot of the principles that we do have are fairly new principles. And it's all based on new technology and new opportunities in research. So what I can tell you is that it is a significant concern of ours and should have been looked at more closely. Whether or not it's going to have a substantial impact has yet to be determined. And it's also one of the things that we've said multiple times is, once you start digging into the area, you disturb the geology, you disturb the hydrology of the region. And if, say, at 500 feet, we see a significant change in the hydrologic feature of the river or so forth, it's not like you can just fill the pit back up and say, sorry. And so it is a concern. The other problem is it takes quite a while for water to move through these geologic features, especially at longer distances. And so it could be that we've aged water on our property in various locations for other research projects and student projects. And what we found out is that in some cases the water is very old, decades old. And so it may be that we don't see the actual impact until much later. And so this is, again, falls under the category of uncertainty in science. And scientists typically operate under what's referred to as the precautionary principle. If you don't know, it's best to err on the side of caution rather than moving ahead with the project and facing a potential significant risk.
So the bottom line is it might be incompatible or it could be compatible.
With that one issue, it certainly can fall under that category. It's
We
yet to be
really
determined.
don't know the answer, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I think some of the other issues, things like lighting and noise, impacts to wildlife movement that we'll be talking about shortly, those are certainly incompatible and have direct and immediate impacts. Some of the longer-term hydrologic and geologic features have yet to be determined and won't be noticed immediately.
Yeah, I referred to it a little earlier, but on this tour that we went through, I don't know whether I got the facts straight there, and maybe you can comment on them. I thought, though, that Rancho California had agreed to put in like 3 gallons a minute or 3 cubic foot per second above, I don't know if it's above the bridge or somewhere above the property, and you actually saw a higher amount of water coming through there. And my question to Mr. Cato was, could that be coming from the mountain? And I'd like to get your assessment of whether I got the numbers right or not.
It's about right. It's 3.5, minimum 3.5 cubic feet per second, based on the 2002 Quarry agreement, and a maximum of 15 feet per cubic feet for a second. Anyway, so basically the issue is, and we've looked at this in the past, is that what's being pumped in, especially during the summertime, early parts of the year when we know we don't have precipitation, and the surface runoff from the tributary, there's one tributary called Devil's Creek, has gone to a trickle. When you go to the top of the property and you observe what's being put into the river, and then you go to the place in the middle of the property that we were at, you notice a substantial change and difference in the amount of water that's moving through the river. What it's attributed to, is, as far as anybody can guess, is the movement of water through the adjacent mountains. And of course, it's demonstrates a hydrologic connection.
They could either come from the mountain to the south adjacent to the quarry, or could it come from the north on your properties, north of the gorge?
North of the gorge. Oh, on the other side of it.
Yeah, I'm saying there's two sides to the...
Yeah, there's two sides.
The river.
One mountain is certainly a lot larger and has a lot more storage capacity than the other.
So it could come from either side, but probably, is it a high probability then it would come from the south side, the side in which the quarry would be located?
I think that's probably a fair statement. Again, it falls into that category of something we haven't actively researched. But we have noticed that there are substantial differences in flows, and it can be attributed to additional surface flows.
Okay, one of the things that I've been after staff to provide, and maybe you can tell me whether it's going to be provided or will be provided this afternoon, is I've asked for a list of all the experiments that are currently in place on the reserve property, and a statement from the researcher that's responsible for that as to whether or not the research will be affected by the mine. And I can think of, we stopped once, I think, at a seismic area, and I thought, the guy that was doing research on seismicity there ought to be just happy as a pig in slop, as they say. And because they're blasting right next to him, and he can check out what the blast means to him in terms of seismic. But other research may not, like it. So is there any list like that that's available to the commission, to see what, anybody, because the way that it kind of looks, if you look at it from the top down, is that San Diego State is categorically, opposed to the project, and if there's nobody there that actually has any desire to see the mine go in because it might help the project. So can you comment on that?
Well, okay, so let me back up maybe 5 years and say we attempted to do this with the county then. And at that time, there were well over 70 research projects active on the property. During the draft EIR, there was an assessment conducted by the county or the county's consultants that asked the researchers in a survey form what they're doing, how they're doing it, and where they're doing it. We were asked to participate in this to help facilitate, communication with the researchers and so forth. And during that period, we had requested that the county also include a question to the researchers of whether or not they perceive, based on what we know about the project at that time, an impact, potential impact to their research programs. That section of the questionnaire was ultimately removed from the project, and the response, the letter that our researchers received from the county said, basically tell us what you're doing and where you're doing it, and our consultants will determine whether or not there's an impact. Several of our researchers contacted our office, and several of them refused to respond, primarily because some of these folks are working with proprietary sensors and information and research that's novel to their field, and it's brand new information and technology. And so they felt as though, who are these consultants? We all in the research arena tend to have egos, and so, who are these consultants that are, potentially unqualified to make that judgment call on whether or not it will impact our programs. And so what ultimately was put into the EIR was basically what's being done and where. And the diluted form of that survey was what was provided. So we've attempted to do this in the past, is what I'm trying to say. I'd be happy to help facilitate another round of this. And I understand that Granite Construction had done this with several of our researchers already. The problem being we're not clear what information was actually provided to those researchers or whether it was a valid assessment. One of those projects is no longer a project at the reserve, and they were more or less just a distributor of technology and equipment for a research project. Another one of those projects actually was cited. It's part of the Plate Boundary Observatory, and had the quarry been at the property prior to the siting of the Plate Boundary Observatory, this property would have been precluded from research because that was one of the criteria in selecting the site. So, I mean, it really gets down to how you ask the question is what I'm saying, and that's one of our biggest concerns is who's going to be asking the questions and how will these questions be asked.
Okay, right now, I'm asking the question. And the question is still, I don't want anybody's proprietary information. I don't think that any proprietary information is necessary for the question that I'm asking, and that is, what are the projects, put them down in a tabular form and a listing, who the researcher is, and if he thinks it's going to affect his research in a large way, in very little, or whatever it is. That's really all I'm trying to find out is what happens there, and are there people there that it doesn't affect their research at all,
Well, and certainly that's the case. I mean, there's a number of projects that will probably never be affected by the quarry. I mean, somebody coming out to collect a beetle, if they can find the beetle, a project's successful, right? So certainly that's the case. We did provide in our response to the final EIR a list of projects and how the projects will be impacted by the proposed quarry in categories such as air quality, water quality, wildlife movement studies, and so forth. And so we have a tentative list that we provided as examples of those research projects. The comment letter also provided by San Diego State University was a combination. We provided the departments and the faculty and staff and so forth that were part of that. Those include researchers that have active projects within the ecological reserve or have had recent projects within the reserve. And so those comments, when it refers to impacts to research or so forth, are included in that. I understand what you're trying to get at, and we're more than happy to help facilitate that dialogue and try and do some sort of assessment. It probably won't happen by next week. We have roughly 50 projects ongoing on the reserve right now. And again, we have both national and international users, so it'll take a little bit of time to try and track down these folks and get their interpretation. But we're happy to help facilitate that if you think it's necessary.
I think it would be very helpful to the commission to know what's going on there, and whether there's people that just say, hey, it's not going to bother me one bit. In fact, I love it because it's going to blast, and I'm checking seismicity or something, So I just feel like it would be good for everybody to know what's the actual research. I'm talking about the primary researcher. I'm not talking about somebody that's doing some groundwork for it. I'm talking about the person that is in charge of the research and responsible for it.
Yeah. And then I'd also say that in our comments, habitually what we've recommended is that the county look at future research potential as well, because certainly one of the things we could become if a quarry is placed in that location is we could become an ecological reserve dedicated to monitoring the impacts of mining. That's certainly not our 50-year legacy, and certainly is a substantially different direction than where we've come from. However, if that is our option, that's potentially what could happen. What we're also concerned with and what we've provided is multiple lists. And at one time we received a request from the county to tell us what do you expect to do on your property for the next 75 years. It's a difficult question to answer. In fact, the National Science Foundation asked a very simple question a few years ago, which is, what is the direction of science for the next 5 years? And the answer was, we don't know. And so asking us, what potential research would occur on the ecological reserve for 3/4 of a century is a difficult question to answer. But we provided as comprehensive a list as possible of potential research opportunities based on what has occurred or what may occur into the future. And so from our perspective as stewards of an ecological reserve, that is also one of our primary concerns, not just protecting the integrity of existing research programs, but providing opportunities into the future that fit with the character of the last half century of the ecological reserve.
Okay, you can provide anything to us, I think
We'll do that. Thank you.
thank you.
I had a follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Commissioner?
Again, when we were out there, we were out there a good 3 hours, and I'm wondering, when you're out there, the ambient noise level is remarkably low. I can only imagine what it's like at night. Do you have measurements for that? And have you compared what those measurements are to what the applicant has assumed?
No. One of the things that we've been asked multiple times is how some of our research programs sort of relate to, and in a moment you'll hear about a research projects for the last 5 years dealing with wildlife linkage. One of the primary concerns we have with those types of questions, and they're absolutely valid, is you often have to use whatever data are available to answer questions that are posed. However, a lot of times the studies that are done on the ecological reserve aren't designed to answer a question about an impact to a quarry. It's a substantially different sort of analysis and research design and so forth. And so it makes it a bit challenging to try and shoehorn in one project into answering another question. But to get back to your point is no, we've never done it because, you know, our, I don't know if you've seen the state budget lately, but it's not doing so well. So, you know, it makes it challenging for us to have to respond and participate in these forums because we've certainly deferred a lot of management costs and other critical features of the ecological reserve to be able to deal with this project for the last 5 years. And so we don't choose to spend our limited resources on trying to answer questions that the EIR should have answered in the first place.
I understand. But you did mention, though, when you reviewed the reports, they did kind of put all of the species into one category, like the Leesville vireo, can, I assume, with independent research, has been shown that it can withstand, if that's the proper term, 60 dB.
That's exactly the number.
And we don't know how that really applies to the other species that are frequent visitors in that area.
Correct.
And so how would you recommend that we rectify that? What would be, ask the same question of you that I asked of the traffic consultant, what would be the recommended protocol methodology?
I think, and we've said this in a lot of our comments to the draft report and final report, and let me summarize it this way. It's like comparing bowling balls to BBs. In an EIR, you're taking a 40,000-foot view of environmental impacts, and so it's at a scale that's fairly coarse. As a research laboratory and education facility that's dedicated to understanding the physical and natural environment, we were looking for an analysis that's at a much finer resolution to be able to determine how that may actually impact and get to your question, Chairman. And so we haven't seen that analysis, and so this is what makes the whole process a little bit difficult because from a scientific perspective, my recommendation would be to look at a suite of species that are representative of biodiversity within a reasonable footprint or buffer of the quarry site, and then to be able to often, like I say, with the Wildlands Group or others, there's research on similar types of species and how they respond to sound or light or whatever the issue may be. But oftentimes we're working in a vacuum of information. So again, you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, saying that, well, this salamander is similar to that one, and there was a study done in Kansas in 1989 about sound effects on this salamander, so maybe it's similar to what's going on here, right? And so you often take these leaps of faith. And again, it falls under uncertainty and what we don't know. And so it could be that we've picked the wrong salamander as a representative sample, or we picked the wrong study, and ultimately you will see those impacts. So from purely a scientific perspective, and certainly I know this goes well beyond what the requirements of CEQA are, But because our property is so unique, from a scientific perspective, we would want to see those actual scientific studies to determine whether or not these species are sensitive to noise and so forth. Now, again, this is just from a scientific perspective, not from a CEQA perspective.
From a real world perspective, what I was wondering is would it be feasible, would it be plausible to actually conduct some kind of noise test where you have, I understand there's going to be loaders operating into the night. Loaders have backup beepers and things like that. Is it feasible to try and recreate that or simulate that at the quarry site and then measure? I mean, was that thought of? Was that something that you would recommend?
I don't know really. I mean, I guess we could back up a truck and see what happens. I mean, the problem is, we have these options of simulating, impacts and environmental noise and light pollution and so forth. There's also plenty of representative research that we've provided. I mean, we provided roughly 3,000 pages of additional supporting research to sort of substantiate the claims and the concerns that we had and say, that this information has been vetted at some level through peer-reviewed science, and we do understand what these issues are. The experimental studies you're talking about are really complicated, and trying to glean this information out of the EIR, which is what we're trying to do, was very difficult. There was a section in the noise analysis that referred to the blasting being no louder than the noise coming from closing a trunk on a car. At that point when we got to that part of the analysis, I mean, I've been near blasts before, and I remember it being a little bit louder than that. And so it's hard to sort of predict what decibel level that is, how far that extends, how the topography responds, and what species may be of concern. Key to your question is of course, the species assessment that was done in the EIR. Both temporal and spatial variability, but as far as temporal variability over the years of developing and working on this project, they represented roughly 1% of the spatial or temporal variability within the project area, which means less than 2 days a year actually doing a biological assessment. Well, that's well below industry standards. So technically, we don't really know what's even on the property to be able to do those kind of studies. So again, it goes back to what are the basic bits of information. Obviously, as scientists, we would be looking for at least industry standards, but actually a lot more, because we know with probabilities of detection and all of the constraints of being able to monitor and observe species, it's much more complicated than you see at the bowling ball or the 45,000 foot level.
Well, and my final question is, and Mr. Jones, I don't mean to put you on the spot, or somebody from staff, if there was ever a case of quote-unquote sensitive receptors close by, I would think you would fit into that category. Did we provide for that level of analysis? Did we call them sensitive receptors and require a more comprehensive, in-depth analysis because of the quote-unquote sensitive receptors close by?
Yes, this is Marty Darris with the River Corporation, the EIR manager. Yes, let me clarify a couple of things. First of all, we did take noise measurements in the SMER property, in the property itself. We took 24-hour, 7-day recordings at 3 separate locations within SMER under the permission of Matt and his staff. So that is presented in the EIR and in the technical appendices. The other thing about we have sensitive receptors. The entire SMER is considered a conservation area under the MSHCP. So we utilize the urban wildlife interface guidelines, and those require us to look at the SMER as a residential use and to apply residential noise standards to that area. We hypothetically put 2 sensitive receptors right at the border between SMER that adjoins the mine site. They're receptors 36 and 37. One's on the west and one's on the north. Our modeling of the noise indicated that we would exceed those, the residential noise. Therefore, we had to mitigate it, and the mitigation was that we had to set back 400 feet on the north in order to achieve the noise standards. And on the southwest, we had to reduce and eliminate all the mining and the pond activity that was going to go on in the southwest portion. So we'd have a setback of approximately, I think, about 1,200 feet on the west, because the SMER adjoins the project boundary. So yes, we did look at those are considered sensitive receptors.
And what level of noise did you assume? Because I think on one hand you have, maybe some backup beeping noises from a loader or a truck. On the other hand, you have maybe a constant, hum, if you will, of saying, maybe a crusher or something like that going on. Or if it's not a crusher, some kind of processing plant, whether it's a batch plant or an asphalt plant or something. Did you make those assumptions, or how did you?
Yes, all the equipment on the site, trucks, the equipment, all the plants are assumed to be operating on the hours that they were applied for. And those started at 4 a.m. in the morning to 12 p.m. at night. There's additional mitigation within the EIR because of some of those facilities. You can't, if you run in a mall, the noise would exceed the thresholds. And so therefore we had to add additional mitigation, at which time at nighttime hours, which are considered 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. according to the general plan, that there can only be one plant operating, not mining, not the aggregate plant. It can only be the asphalt plant or the concrete plant. The aggregate plant and the recycling plant can only be operated during daytime hours. So the model incorporates all the noise, and let me also state that I'm not a noise modeler, and we would be able to respond to this in more detail with the noise consultant. But all this noise is accumulated into the model and then utilized compared to the background noise measurements that we've taken.
But from dusk until 10 p.m., all of that noise generating can happen simultaneously.
That's correct.
That's correct. Well, how do we know what species are being impacted by? A lot of species like to come out at dusk and start hunting. How do we know how that will be impacted?
The residential, well, we're complying with the residential noise standards that were required through the MSHCP. We took the assumption that the MSHCP looked at what impacts noise would have on wildlife species and utilized that as our standard.
What other choices were there other than residential?
I believe, and I'll let Matt correct me, I believe residential noise standards are the strictest in the county.
Is it even for sensitive receptors?
Well, I think the question is, what is that level? Is that 65 dB?
It's 65 during the day and 45 at night.
So that doesn't relate to what's existing? What it is?
Let me also, I didn't know you're right.
Well, it doesn't relate to the 65 during the day is what MSHCP looked at, or the county calls for. It doesn't answer directly the question how that would impact these other species. If there's any active during the day, that would hear that. So. And we're not calling you wrong, it's just that's the way that it was analyzed. And then we have to weigh if that was good enough or not.
That's correct. I mean, we depended on what the MSHCP found with respect to noise impacts on wildlife. And we also, there are areas like, that are like SMER. I think the baseline for that and the other receptors on the west side was 39 decibels, which is very, very quiet. So we also looked at the change in noise, which is we used a 5 decibel, which is a standard increase in noise. So therefore, even if you were below the standard, if you increased the noise by over 5, which is an amount that has been determined by research that is noticeable by a person, if you have a 5 decibel increase, that those were also considered significant impacts, and we also had to mitigate those as part of the mitigation package we put together.
So that setback that you talked about, does that reduce the increase to 5 dB at the property line?
Yes, with mitigation, all the noise standards are achieved. We have a less than significant impact.
So noise was the primary reason driving the revised footprint, operational footprint?
It was one, yes. One of them, yes. The other one was aesthetics, and the other one and cultural resources, and
From an operational standpoint, it was noise.
Yes.
Thank you.
Commissioner, may I respond?
Anybody else?
One of the recommendations that the county made to the consultants after the original scoping session was that the ecological reserve be treated as though it were a national park. And they provided case law to sort of help justify that level of analysis. Certainly we're not a national park, but as you've heard over the multitude of meetings and statements, we have unique features that are one of a kind and irreplaceable in Southern California. And so we had assumed as the EIR was being developed that some level of significance beyond the residential area was going to be applied to the ecological reserve. It was not. And so when you look at the analysis and you see that there are significant unavoidable impacts documented by the EIR, and then the follow-up conclusion is that there's no significant impact to the ecological reserve, it just sort of defies logic.
So is there a national park standard versus a residential standard? So it seems like the residential standard is maybe, I know it's maybe the most stringent that we have for our general plan, but is it reasonable to apply that in this case? And maybe that's the only tool that we had in our general plan toolbox, if you will. Is that the case, Mr. Sprague? Yes. All right. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Ron, go ahead.
Of course. I wanted to ask the EIR manager. Yes. The speaker said that the site researchers, projects, the experiments, about 60 to 70, they were asked to send information about what sort of impacts, if any, the project would have on their projects, and that you would determine whether they were important or significant or not. Is that an accurate characterization?
It's an accurate characterization. Let me say that Matt was very helpful in providing information because, like Matt mentioned, we weren't able to get a lot of responses back until he and his staff were able to email them directly. And we did receive about 70 responses finally. We sent out about 90 requests. And then we categorize them. It's all summarized in the SMER impact section in the draft EIR. What we looked at it was whether or not noise, for an example, increased in specific areas within the SMER. And using the noise modeling, we determined that the noise levels did not increase substantially within the SMER. And we have different receptors located throughout the SMER with the noise modeling results shown on these. And based on that information, based on for example, light, the lighting requirements with respect to any project in that part of the county due to the Mount Palomar ordinances are very stringent. And our light consultant determined that there was no trespass of light that would extend outside our boundaries. So therefore, there's no increase in lighting outside or within the SMER. Matt brought up the point that, and he's correct, that yes, you would be able to see the light from SMER if you were an animal or a person or a researcher, but there would be no light trespass or increase in lighting within the SMER due to the lights on the site. We also put restrictions on mining at night so that there would be no lighting outside the plant area at the nighttime.
I was supposed to make sense of that.
I'm sorry.
I'm trying to distinguish between trespass of light.
Well, I'm sorry.
The increase in the light.
There's no
escaping.
There's no light escaping from the.
Matt says you can see the light.
Well, you'd always be able to see a light any place. You know, you can see a street light for miles and miles. I'm saying the lighting from the from the project isn't going to light up anything outside. The light is meant to obviously make a safe working atmosphere for the
Illuminate
plant.
the site with it.
Exactly, yes.
So there are not going to be any beams of light, if you will, shining on the reserve.
Well, that's correct.
That's what you're trying to say, right? That's what you're saying.
Yes, and there wouldn't even be any other light that would actually be able to be measured that would increase the light level off the site.
Well, but I think what we're trying to figure out here is let's assume that you've got some experiment going on the reserve where you're trying to measure, an animal's response or something like that, or whether it's a wildlife corridor or what have you. You're not disputing that there's going to be this glow of light that somebody standing on the reserve would be able to see on the applicant's site. Are you? I mean,
You'll be able to see light just as you'd be able to see light from the freeway.
Exactly.
Light from the place.
right, okay? And I think our question is how will that observance of light affect whether it's a species or an experiment or something else happening on the reserve? We don't know.
You don't know? No, we wouldn't absolutely know. However, there is light in the area now. I mean, every house has a safety light. There's lights from Temecula.
Oh, no, wait, we're talking about from observing from the reserve. I mean, you look in that direction right now, you're not seeing light, correct?
Well, that's,
Uh,
well, you might be able to see glow from the border station, from the way station, from the freeways.
Well, but it's a little bit of a dish there, looking up on the hillside. I mean, when we were there, it was obvious that we're looking up at the project site. Anyway, from my personal experience, and I don't know if some of you've been out on the reserve site, I would think you would see this glow of light, and it definitely could have some impacts on experiments or species or something else. But I get your point. There's not going to be any light, shining on the reserve. Certainly, you will be able to see a glow of light from the project.
Let's maybe go to a minor baseline. I remember a previous speaker saying that the light would obliterate the full more ability to see the night sky. Is that an accurate assessment?
Absolutely not. They have to comply with the Mount Palomar ordinance lighting. This lighting plan has been reviewed by the county and has been reviewed by Mount Palomar, and they both found it to be acceptable.
So unless we can get critters to respond, we won't know what their disturbance might be. We just have to make that determination based upon the models that you have and the levels of possibles.
I think that might have ended that discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Well, I assume that you must be Kelsey Strickland. Is that correct? Let me see if your helper here.
Oh, right.
Wendy Chowning. Alrighty. And Terry Iancardi? Terry? Terry, are you here? I'm mispronouncing your name. See her, Gloria Jacobson? Okay. And Barbara Eagle? Looks like we're missing one of your supporters. You have some more? Yeah, we only need one more, and I'll give you your 10 minutes.
Just one.
That's all we need for her 10 minutes.
If I have the rest of
Sonia Maxon. Sonia? Or did we hold a blank? Sonia, are you here? No? I guess we need another one. Now, if this one doesn't work, we're going to ask you for the whole stack until we find it.
You got it.
Joe Torres? You've been forsaken.
Is that a good one? All right.
DJ Murphy. Come on, PJ, where are you?
Mr. Chairman, if I may suggest, why don't we let her proceed? If she runs out of time, I will ask her some questions and let her finish.
It's challenging to get people to stay this late.
It's challenging to talk faster.
That's true. Good afternoon, my name is Kelsey Stricker. I would like to speak briefly today on the biological assessment in the EIR and its treatment of the many sensitive and endemic species that would be impacted by the proposed Liberty Quarry. The EIR, as it is written, does not adequately address impacts to sensitive species present within the footprint of the proposed quarry. What is disconcerting is the total disregard for accepted industry standards for biological data collection, interpretation, and dissemination. A good scientist understands that the ecosystem is dynamic and multifaceted and thus cannot be adequately interpreted during a quick snapshot viewing. In addition, the EIR fails to address the area's most sensitive species and did not follow accepted survey protocols, including those developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The purpose of an environmental impact report is to determine which species may be present within the proposed project footprint and how the project may affect these species. Based on those assessments, the EIR can then recommend appropriate avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures. This EIR has been inadequate on all three of these points. It has failed to determine which species may be present within the project site because in the 6 years it has taken to develop this document, less than 2 days a year were spent in the field collecting data. In addition, no actual data were collected on the Santa Ana Palomar Mountains linkage. Data that were freely provided to the authors of this document were used selectively, with some data simply being excluded. In addition, data analyses and peer-reviewed publications provided by SDSU and its researchers were alternately discredited or disregarded. The Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve has hosted research on the movement of wildlife and habitat conservation since the early 1990s. These projects have been conducted by some of the most highly respected agencies, universities, and scientists in the United States, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Game, U.S. Geological Survey, UC Davis, San Diego State University, Northern Arizona University, Colorado State University, and CSU San Marcos. The crux of this research has generally been to recommend the highest levels of conservation and protection of a small wildlife movement area between Temecula and Rainbow along Highway 15. Originally designated by the South Coast Wildlands Missing Linkages Project as the most essential linkage for mountain lion population stability in the Santa Ana Mountains, the linkage is also the last inland to coastal linkage in Southern California. This area has become the focus of conservation and land acquisition supported by a variety of organizations, including SDSU, the Nature Conservancy, the Fallbrook Land Conservancy, the Trust for Public Lands, Endangered Habitats League, Sierra Club, and Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. This linkage supports the movement of not only mountain lions, but also many of the other key carnivores and other species present in the Southern California ecosystem. The linkage is designed as a biodiversity linkage, not just a linkage for mountain lions. In fact, a variety of other species have been documented in the area, such as coyotes, bobcat, gray foxes, badgers, raccoons, and possum, not to mention the myriad of small mammals, lizards, and birds. These species are all essential to maintaining the critically sensitive ecosystem found throughout the linkage and in surrounding contiguous habitat. While the mountain lion is an apex predator, these other species have substantially different habitat associations, usage, and behaviors than the mountain lion. Therefore, the EIR's sole and selective reliance on the mountain lion data is misplaced and seriously misrepresents the risks and impacts from the proposed quarry. There is great interest in how the I-15 freeway may or may not be affecting the movement of biodiversity. Some have declared the area to be a severed linkage simply due to the size of the I-15. Beginning in 2006, we have been conducting a wildlife monitoring program which was developed to assess the permeability of the linkage and movement of wildlife. Although the I-15 freeway bisects the most constrained portion of the linkage, it is very much a functional linkage. The 2006 pilot program demonstrated that animals were present at the culvert entrances and potentially crossing under the freeway and circumventing the vehicle hazards. The idea of carnivores and other animals using culverts to cross under the roads to avoid traffic is not a phenomenon unique to this linkage. It has been observed and studied throughout the world, including Spain, Portugal, Germany, and other areas throughout the United States. Formal research and monitoring, particularly from 2009 to 2010, has collected data on carnivore movement both at the I-15 culverts and in the immediately adjacent habitat of the Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve. Currently, I am the only researcher conducting an active monitoring and assessment program in the linkage area. We have documented medium to small carnivores and other animals using these culverts, demonstrating the viability of the special linkage area. Key species detected in the area include bobcat, raccoon, gray fox, and coyote. Within the contiguous habitat of the reserve, additional carnivores, including mountain lions, have been captured on camera. This suggests not only a robust population of carnivores and therefore a healthy ecosystem, it also suggests a significant amount of potential animal movement, in other words, immigration and emigration through the linkage. Unlike the stationary cameras used in 2006, which took still photographs of animals, the video cameras now used also collect information on behavior. What has been observed is not the skittish, evasive behavior of frightened animals. Instead, animals are approaching and moving through the linkage with less apprehension than would be expected if they were encountering a novel, stressful, or frightening stimuli. Animals captured on camera in the culvert area are habitually using these areas as part of their regular movement patterns. This linkage is far from dead. Certainly, considerable conservation restoration efforts are required to ensure that this last linkage is protected. Some have suggested modifying the undercrossings, while others have promoted the idea of wildlife overpass. Both solutions have considerable merit in this particular linkage and could ultimately provide the long-term planning that would protect this area. However, it should be noted that these recommendations are based on the existing land uses and impacts, not as a way to offset the potential impacts of the proposed Liberty Quarry. Furthermore, the special linkage area was not intended to protect just a 1-by-4 mile patch of land, but rather serve as a connection between the vast areas of the Santa Ana and Palomar Mountains. So these expansive lands and their long-term conservation are significantly tied to this constrained area. Prior conservation planning for the linkage acknowledged that the area is already impacted and constrained. The past 2 decades of planning, conservation, and research attempted to rectify this situation rather than disregard the linkage and declare the site beyond restoring. The EIR asserts that the quarry footprint is only a small fraction of the actual linkage. This is far from the truth. The quarry impacts the entire western extent of the designated special linkage area under the MSHCP and represents roughly 1/3 of the remaining constrained portion of the total linkage area that is left. This does not take into consideration the additional impacts that preclude wildlife movement beyond the simple physical quarry footprint, including lighting, noise, vibration, and blasting. In reality, the impact of the quarry to wildlife movement and persistence extends far beyond the actual physical scar that the quarry would create. Granite has argued that they are only impacting 6% of the designated linkage area. This is true. However, even if it were just 1%, the scale and location of the project is what matters. A loss of 6% of 4 square miles seems insignificant, unless it is the entire western extent of what is intended to serve as a wildlife corridor. Finally, I wanted to briefly speak about the data used in the IR and the assessment that was conducted. First, the telemetry data they cite does not support their conclusions. In fact, their interpretation is based on telemetry data collected nearly 20 years ago with old technology, which means lots of error and problems with the data. These historical research projects were never intended to assess the impacts of a quarry. This is a completely different study design entirely. Therefore, the only data and analysis on the wildlife movement is that which has been collected since 2009 and has been shared with the county. Their experts dismissed the data to discredit scientifically reviewed and published research in biology and geography. In fact, they have collected no data or conducted any rigorous studies of the linkage, largely because they would have found the same things we are, that wildlife are diverse, healthy, and using the habitat throughout the reserve and through the special linkage area. I ask, how will we maintain a functional linkage if the proposed quarry is permitted? Perhaps a catapult is in order. It's been a long day.
Well, you brought the house down.
I tried.
Thank you. Are you going to ask some questions about trampolines now?
No. Trampoline question. But my questions, I think I started to pose to Dr. Ram, may be more appropriate for you.
Sure.
Okay, so now we have backup beepers and we have rumblings from dusk until 10 p.m. They're all happening at the same time, and there's a glow of light. And we're in the winter months. You know these wildlife corridors, it sounds like better than anyone here. What do you think the impacts will be?
Well, I should state that the project I'm working on is designed to assess wildlife movement. It's not at all designed to assess the impacts of a quarry. However, what I can say is that there's a significant body of research on both nighttime ambient lighting effects on wildlife and also noise on wildlife. And a lot of them have to do with nighttime glow and how that affects animal movement. It ranges everything from artificial lighting, lighting from highways and projects and border checkpoints and those kinds of things on carnivores, to even how moon phase, subtle changes in really low amounts of nighttime lighting can have substantial effects on animal behavior, both in their ability to successfully hunt. My primary area of expertise is carnivores, so this is generally where I have a little bit more information. But in general, what they've looked at is both, under full moon and also under high artificial nighttime lighting standards. Carnivores will generally avoid these areas, which is why most people who live in areas along the wildland-urban interface that are worried about mountain lions, all you really have to do is turn on your porch light at night and you won't get mountain lions in your backyard. They're very cryptic species. So.
All right, so in your professional opinion, have the impacts been adequately analyzed in terms of the impacts of this quarry on wildlife in that general vicinity?
No.
All right.
That's it.
Okay, let me ask you a question then.
Go ahead.
You briefly mentioned the bridge.
Mhm.
Is the bridge still under consideration, or has it been rejected as a method, or what?
Well, in terms of,
Of being a linkage. You know,
in terms of
over
assisting the
freeway.
linkage movement?
Yeah, instead of going under it and through culverts,
I-
going over it.
I think there are some definite interests, especially from conservation groups, in putting in a wildlife overpass that would assist wildlife movement. There's been some success, most notably in Canada and Banff National Park, with their overpass there. It would take some time to determine the best place to put the linkage to ensure that we're capturing where exactly species are moving even within the special linkage area. But it's still a viable option. I guess I'm not in charge of funding the project.
I'm trying to find out if anybody is actively studying where it should be. You know.
That'd be me.
I'm sorry.
I'm the only person studying wildlife movement in the area. There's been some modeling done, and also a geography master's student, Phil Gibbons, out of SDSU, did some GIS modeling as well as ground truthing on looking at mountain lion movement within the special linkage area, and has, based on modeled results, given an idea, that was one of the slides that was presented, of where the best areas for mountain lion movement are and where it's expected that they are going to move. The best way to construct a linkage, though, would be to collect data not just on mountain lions, but on a suite of other species. And one of the ways that this linkage was originally designated in 2001 by South Coast Wildlands Missing Linkages Project was looking at a suite of species. Everything from insects to small mammals to lizards, snakes, mountain lions, and this linkage, which has been presented in multiple slides, is what they came up with.
So the thing is, this would be a fairly substantial financial offer, I think, then to put a bridge across there.
Correct.
And if you put it in the wrong place, then the animals don't use it.
It's a possibility, but that's always a possibility that you could put it in the wrong place.
Do you think if it is there, they would use that rather than the underpass and the
Most of the literature that looks at the use of animals' opportunistic use of culverts to pass over and under bridges or over and under freeways, a lot of it has to do with local variability, depends on the species. Sometimes it can depend on the density of the species, on what they call inter and intra-species interactions. So it has to do with the social structure of the species and a lot of different variables.
Has there been anything done or any studies made of trying to direct the mammals and what have you into a particular underpass or overpass or whatever?
Yes, there have been multiple, they're all species specific. Some of the ones that have been used are directional fencing for deer to funnel them in certain areas. They've got a frog underpass, I believe up in the Davis area, that all it took was stringing some Christmas lights underneath a gutter to get the frogs to go through to cross the road. And so, it's very species specific, and there have been some efforts to funnel animals in certain areas.
It sounds like material for another one of your fancy slides there.
Absolutely.
Christmas lights. Anyway, is the I-15 currently fenced to prevent, say, mountain lions and bobcats and things that might try to cross the I-15?
No, not within the linkage area. I'm not familiar with the whole.
Do you have
extent.
knowledge of kills of mountain lions and other large vertebrates?
I have my personal roadkill data that I've collected since 2006. I know that Walter Boyce does a lot of work with mountain lions in this area and has telemetry data and roadkill data as well. His work is a little bit further north in sort of the area of the Santa Rosa Plateau, but I do have roadkill data.
And how many mountain lions may have been killed since 2006?
There's none that I have collected.
Okay, so
I can only speak to my personal
they
data.
apparently are using the culvert and then going under the bridge.
Yes, it's likely.
Thank you, Mr. Forrest.
I'd like to ask the EIR manager, do you have a response to any of the points that she made regarding adequacy of your assessment as far as the corridor? Andrew, would you like to wait until we're done?
Well, is your question more geared to the MSUCP consistency and the county's position on that? Because the MSUCP was certainly the guide that we used in order to analyze the special linkage that exists in the MSUCP. And in the MSUCP, it explains that any projects in that special linkage area would have to do a full CEQA analysis of any possible impacts. That was certainly done in the EIR. And besides that, the SLA, or the special linkage area, isn't a criteria cell, so it doesn't have any specific criteria that has to be met. All it really says is that you have to have that EIR level analysis, which is done. So the county's opinion is that we're consistent with the MSUCP.
And Ms. Stricker, you're saying it's inadequate?
Yes, I believe so. One of the main reasons being that they were provided mountain lion data and only part of it was used.
They didn't incorporate auto lift.
Correct.
That was critical.
Correct.
Let me ask
Always good to use all the data.
Sure. Yes. Ms. Stricker, one of the things that you mentioned was looking at the culverts specifically, and migration of animals through that. Initially, skittishness has turned into, they've accepted as there's a certain
well, what I had-
in the exhibit.
What I had mentioned was that the animals were not skittish, which is what you would expect if they were having an apprehensive or timid approach to the
Initially.
culvert area.
Isn't that adaptation?
In terms of, are you talking about habituation?
Yes.
Yes, it can be seen that way, but since there was no study prior to the implementation of the I-15, we can't assume that that's the case.
Well, you made some certain assumptions about how they change their behavior. But again, it's not based scientifically. Can you make an assumption that, let's say that the impacts that you've identified, noise, blasting, whatever, that will have an impact on them? The applicant is saying, an applicant's representative, is it's not really there. It's marginal, minimal, less than significance. Let's say that there is some impact.
Yes.
Could they overcome that and adapt also?
It
don't
would
know.
really depend on the species. There have been
The
some, for
variables.
example, for noise, there have been some studies done, one in which where they collared coyotes in a military area, where the noise levels were similar to what has been discussed for this project, and the animals were shown to alternately either change the boundaries of their territory to avoid the noise or abandon the territory completely.
And that could happen.
That is a possibility.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure that they'll grow wings and fly, as you've depicted in your slides, but the adaptability of animals has become remarkable, especially when you look at YouTube and you see deer shopping in stores. So
Right. Well, there are urban adapted species,
Yes.
and there are those species that do not adapt well to urban environments. Most people are familiar with raccoons and occasionally coyotes rummaging through their garbage cans in their backyard. That is what we call an urban adapted species. However, we're also familiar with the fact that when people move in, certain species like mountain lions move out because they are not urban adapted
They
species.
don't like light.
They don't like light, they don't like noise. In the case of urban environments, a lot of times, domestic animals and that kind of thing can also deter wildlife.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Next, we have John Brown. And let's see if your folks are going to support you. Sandra Sykes. Sandra. Ah, good. Thank you. You're behind the camera. Petra Valasakos. Petra? Petra. No? No Petra. Rita McCarthy. Rita. Robert Anderson. Hello, Robert Anderson. Well, doesn't look like we can find any of your supporters. One. 4 minutes.
That's more tickets over. I'm John Graham. I'm a research scientist at the San Diego State Visualization Center. I also work at UCSD Cal IQ2 Division as a computer research scientist and the San Diego Supercomputer Center. I'm primarily here today as a resident of the Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve. I live in one of the coolest places in this area. That's my house. So one of the things that I'd like to address is what this will look like. Turn on order. Here's the reserve. Okay. And this is going to be the proposed mine location. One of the things that I've done here is I've dug the pit so you can see how it will look in 70 years compared to the expressway. This is a very large hole. I drink, bathe, and cook with the water that comes out of this mountain. It is extremely pure, extremely abundant. This water leaks from all of the rocks on the side of this hill. Every night that there's a fog bank coming in here, that water table gets replenished. Every night that there's a fog bank, my roof drips and waters my garden. Imagine that multiplied by hundreds of acres. One of the things I also modeled was using the Aloha plume modeling, what a typical dust plume, this is just a simple Gaussian distribution of dust, where it would go. That's the typical wind direction. So we could rotate that around and give you a quick look at where the dust would reach. This is a Gaussian distribution, 0 to 1, and scaled across that. So we can see that easily we're going to hit Rainbow, easily we'll be hitting this church. One of the other things that I haven't heard mentioned is the fact that this cloud bank, this fog bank, it's like a cap over top of the reserve a lot of times. Many times it does not sink down and it does not fill up the valley. That cap will reflect light that comes up out of the pit, and it will act as an umbrella shining it back down around the entire region. The other thing that we have quite a bit, I live on the side of this hill, and depending on the weather conditions, we have a acoustic ducting that basically, it sounds like I live right next to the expressway instead of a mile up the hill. So during many days, you're going to get the explosions in the mine hitting this acoustic. It's basically the difference of humidity, the dry air versus the wet air above it. It creates a reflection. And so that sound will be amplified and pushed back down into the reserve, down into Temecula, just like the light. So that cloud bank is a very, very important aspect, and it's there quite a bit of the time. So I think looking at that, just sampling a 24-hour period of will this light get back into the reserve is not a valid test. Do it for a month. Do it for a year. Some of the other things, the fault lines. Well, geez, that's the Elsinore Fault Complex. These faults are everywhere. These are only the known faults. So having this constant blasting next to a very, very well documented known fault complex is, again, not a good thing to do. The linkages, I'll show you where they fill in here. This is the general linkage between the Palomar and Pendleton areas. And then if we turn on the other linkage, you can see that basically it's stopping the wildlife crossing. It's blocking the whole end of it. Let me turn off a couple of these. So having this mine basically capping the western edge of their way into the reserves, again, not very good.
The last thing I want to show is, these are the gray lines here are the culverts where they're crossing. You can see we have a whole series of them right next to the area of the mine area. That's about all I have. I just want to let you guys know what it'll look like.
Commissioner Bennett?
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that to life as you have. Show me again where you live.
Right here. I can see this church from my house. If you look up on the hill, you'll see an antenna tower, and I live right down below it. I'm a resident scientist on the reserve.
When you say you live there, you live there.
I live there. And when it rains, I stay there because the river gets 14 foot of water over top of the bridge.
So when we were talking earlier about ambient noise,
Yes.
how much of the freeway do you hear?
It depends on the weather. Sometimes I hear absolutely nothing, and sometimes it's like I'm standing next to it. It's all dependent on the humidity of the air above and below. It is a duct effect where the sound waves will travel miles.
Well, I think it's also interesting you pointed out that smog, or fog rather, has
Very reflective.
kind of an umbrella or penumbra type of effect, right?
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if that's been accounted for in the studies. I think you've looked at them. I would doubt that that has been accounted for or taken into consideration.
I'm also a researcher there, so one of the things that I'm doing is a highly sensitive 360-degree microphone array that is intended to voice print birds. And we also have 360-degree video being recorded, so it's basically an automated bird census system where we hear a bird, we swing the high-resolution camera in the vector that we heard it from, get a high-resolution picture, and literally voice print the individual bird so we can see if it's coming back into the range. So absolutely, anything making noise like a low-level rumble, especially from a rock crusher or something like that, that'll saturate my sensor.
Can you go also point to the culverts? That I think that's a very informative exhibit. Probably should have had this before we had our biological consultant up here, but I'm wondering what
obviously, we have some of those culverts that are going to be very in close proximity to the mine, proposed mine. Do you know, are all of those being studied now? Some of them being studied in terms of the traffic, if you will, back and forth? All of them are. And they all have, currently all have traffic back and forth. All right, thank you. It's been very instructive.
Commissioner Boris?
Just real quick. Marty?
Yes.
Could you shed any light on the description of this umbrella, the fog, the clouds that act as an umbrella and reflector for acoustics and light?
I would rather have my technical consultant review that. I know that the noise model it includes humidity and different variety. I'm not sure how it accounts for cloud cover.
Okay, no, I'll read on.
Okay.
Okay, don't go away. I'd like to have our mammal researcher come back up and you can do a little tag team here for a minute. Since we've now got pictures of culverts and what have you. Okay, you had a lot of pictures and you had coyotes and mountain lions, raccoons and what have you. Can you show us on here which culverts they were using? I was under the impression maybe they were down using the bridge and I guess I was unaware that there were this many culverts in the area.
I think there may actually be a couple more that aren't displayed on this graphic.
Where did your pictures come from?
I'm sorry?
Where did your pictures come from? Which culvert?
Well, all of these culverts have been alternately studied. Along this whole stretch, basically my study area begins at about where the exit for the 79 is and extends all the way through Rainbow. So all of these culverts have been studied at different times. I use what's referred to as a rotating panel design, meaning I don't study every single culvert simultaneously, but in order to pick up seasonal variability and differences in movement between the different culverts, it's a statistical design that's designed to be able to capture that variability while not having to study every single culvert at the exact same time. So I can tell you that there have been movement within all of these culverts. What I can't tell you off the cuff, I'd have to take a look at my data, is exactly which animals were at exactly which culvert at exactly which time. It's a multiple year project. But I can tell you that all of the animals that were mentioned in my previous presentation were seen in at least one of these culverts, and most of them have the whole suite of species that are using these culverts.
Okay, I don't want to get too specific. I was interested in down near the bridge there. Are the culverts near the bridge, and were those culverts studied?
With the Rainbow Bridge, is that what you mean?
I mean, I've never heard it called the Rainbow Bridge. It's the one right over the Santa Maria River at the beginning of it right there. At, let's see, at the creek that's going down there.
This one right here?
No, way down toward the city of Temecula.
Yes. Yes, that area has also been studied, and also within the sort of creek bed that you can view from, I guess, the Old Town area, there's also been a significant amount of wildlife movement in that area as well.
Can you characterize which ones had mountain lion movement in them, or all of them? They look like, your pictures of the mountain lion look like some of the cameras that were in the gorge area there and taking pictures down on that flat surface.
Those particular pictures were from the gorge area. There have been now, as I mentioned in the presentation, there were also data collected from the contiguous areas of the reserve, which is also included as part of the footprint. And so I don't have cameras that I've set up in this sort of stream bed area because that's considered a riparian underpass and not necessarily a culvert. So I can't tell you if there are mountain lions moving in this particular area.
I can't. I personally have seen mountain lions and cub right at the gate, which is the bottom of the road. And they come up my road and visit me on a regular basis. I have a bobcat in my front yard hunting the pocket gophers eating my garden.
I see, you're looking for some new meat, I guess, or whatever.
Pocket gophers are tasty.
I see. Okay. All right, that's all the question I have. Thank you. And thank you, sir. Let's see, that's all the speakers from San Diego State that I have, and take a not less than 5-minute break. We'll resume with the speakers from the Pechanga.